My name is Patricia Hamilton Richardson, and I was born near Gallatin, Missouri, on December 18th, 1929.
So tell me about your parents. Who were they and what were they like?
Uh, Mostly straight Ulster Scots, and mother was, they were teachers, daddy farmed, and mother taught third grade for years and years. Of course, remember, we were living in the Great Depression, and married women couldn't hold jobs because that uh, diverted a scarce item from the breadwinners. If you were married and had a child, you had to stay home.
So tell me about your parents. Where did y'all live when you were born and what was it like?
Well, we lived on a farm out east of Gallatin, this county seat of Daviess County. It was on land that had been in the family since about 1850, early 1850s.
Um,
My
Describe the farm. What was it like? The farm was.
farm was like most farms in the Great Depression. There wasn't enough paint on anything because A, you couldn't afford it, and we had a plague of grasshoppers that came and literally ate the paint off the buildings. I watched them when I was like 5 or 4.
Wow. Well,
That
tell
was
me.
what it was like. Um, it was like 150 acres, and they planted corn, wheat, not much wheat. This isn't wheat country. Oats to feed the horses. We had draft horses. Dad had a farm-all tractor.
Uh, Tell me about your parents' parents. What were they like? First, starting with your mom's side.
Mother was from a small town in South Missouri. She was born in Kansas.
Keep going.
Um, she,
Tell me about her parents.
Henry and Sarah Chapel Schwalm. Henry Schwalm was a second generation German from Hesse in Germany. Mother was, my grandmother's maiden name was Chapel. It moved to the Midwest from the South after the Civil War. No, before that, the Civil War. Her name was Sarah Chapel. She married her husband fairly young, and they came from around Muscatine, Iowa. When Mother was born, Florence Hamilton, she was born in Hope, Kansas. Interestingly, it was on a farm, and the neighboring farm was uh, inhabited by a large family, and their last name was Eisenhower. And they had a lot of boys. The boys all did quite well.
So tell me about the rest of your mother's
Uh,
family and your dad's family.
uh, Daddy, Lauren Hamilton, was born in 1893, and he was born very near where I grew up, on a family farm. His father, Henry Hamilton's, farmed, taught country school for years and years. And his mother, Mary Ann Peniston, and was Mary Ann Peniston, and they were the earliest settlers of the county, most of them. The Penistons were. Her grandfather owned the first grist mill in Daviess County in a town called Millport. And where am I going with this, David? I'm trying to think. Um, I know what I'm doing.
You're doing great. Let's keep going. Let me ask you a new question here. Um, you were talking about your family had been around for a long time in this county. Talk about some. What are some other old family stories or family histories that you remember, maybe
Oh,
that we haven't talked about? So family
Well,
history.
we haven't talked about my great grandfather,
Well, let's hear it.
who was Hampton Decatur Hamilton. He was named after Stephen Decatur, the hero of the War of 1812. He was born in 1824 in Daviess County and died in 1916.
Well,
One of the big things he did, he was a 49er. He was a scout on a wagon train. It wasn't 49, I believe they actually went in 1850. Out of Westport, which is now part of Kansas City, by the southern route, and they had oxen.
well, what was life like for 49ers or people like them that went out west?
It
Why
was,
were they going out west, and what was it like when they went?
well, they were going out to Sacramento because of the gold strike. In fact, there was an awful lot of it going on. I think there was kind of a depression going on at that time in the Midwest anyway. And of course, the West was where you went when you couldn't go any further. Kansas City, Missouri, on the conjunction of the Kaw River and the Missouri River, was literally a jumping off place to the west in those years. They formed a wagon train, went to Westport, which is in central Kansas City, went west the next day. Overland Park, Kansas, a well-known suburb on the Kansas side, was actually the first stop on the Santa Fe Trail. It took at least 2 months and possibly 3. They went the southern route, which morphed into Route 66, but they got lost in the Mojave Desert. And Daddy told me this because I think he was almost grown before his grandfather died, so he knew him quite well. Anyway, Grandpa, I never met the man, of course, but anyway, they made it to the gold fields. He actually made some money and kept it and got home with it. And the way you got home from Sacramento was you went to San Francisco, which is Northern California, boarded ship, sailed down the Mexican coast to the Isthmus of Panama, crossed the isthmus by railroad. There was a railroad at that time in Panama. Boarded ship in the Gulf of Mexico side, came up to New Orleans, and then took the riverboat up the Mississippi to where you were going. So he came back by way of St. Louis. He may have had enough gold to buy a section of land in our county. And he married a young lady whose father was Colonel John Hill, who had come to Missouri in the late 1830s over the Cumberland Gap with Daniel Boone, who is incidentally buried near Kansas City. And his whole family came and they settled there too. Anyway, he married this young lady. They were married for a long time. They had 10 children. And great-grandfather Hamilton was able to give each child a farm out of the section of land he bought, which meant growing up, every adjoining farm was owned by and lived on by an aunt or an uncle.
So how big is the section of land? A section of land is
640 acres. Why do I remember that?
So how common was that for someone to go out west and actually find gold and come back and be able to buy land with it?
Not as uncommon as you might think. I've read quite a lot about the history of the gold rush, and I think actually quite a few did. The problem basically was disease in the mining camps. The leader of that particular group going to the gold fields was a gentleman called William Peniston, um, who was an uncle of my grandmother's. And he has an interesting history with the Mormon religion, but I'll go into that later. He died of cholera on the gold fields and is buried near Sacramento.
Yeah.
When I was in my teens, our county paper had a 100 years ago column, and it said 2 Gallatin young men went to the gold fields today.
So it made the paper.
100 years later.
So, tell me, when you were growing up as a kid in Kansas, what was it like? What was life like day to day? Where did you go to school? What did you do?
In those days, I went to country school, and no, I never walked to school in my life. We had a consolidated to a school district. Mother taught in it before I was born. It it wasn't just one room a country school; it was 2 rooms. We were really uptown. There were 6 little girls in my first grade, and we could all read because older brothers and sisters or mothers or somebody had already taught us before we got there. I often think, though, that remember all of this, and I'm talking about the 30s, which we all remember as the Great Depression, except we did, most of us haven't actually lived through it. There just wasn't much money around. REA had not come through, rural electrification. And without power on a farm, you do not have central heating, you don't have electric light, you don't have indoor plumbing as a rule. And I'm no big fan of camping out, I can tell you. It takes real courage to go outside in the cold north wind. And it's very hot in the summertime. But anyway, it wasn't that bad, except that farm wives work incredibly hard.
So, tell me what you mean. What are some examples? What did you see your mom and others do?
I just saw people trying to make do because there wasn't much cash around. There's a very interesting book by Alistair Cook, who somehow during World War II was in Washington, and he was working for the BBC in the US at the time, the British Broadcasting, and he wrote a book about it which got published very late. They found it in a closet in his room years later, about his travels. During the war, he somehow got the okay to get enough gasoline to get in the car and go over the U.S. And he hit North Missouri, and he was talking about how pretty the land was. And he was also talking to the farmers and how they were suddenly getting some money after the Great Depression, and the weather got better, the drought and grasshoppers stopped, and we had a war economy and they had some money. Everything got painted. But you're asking me what it was like. Well, remember, this is before we had a radio. It was powered by a wind charger, which was a miniature windmill on the roof of the house. We had a pitcher pump. No, we didn't have one, but Ron's parents did. We had a pump by the front door and a good well, and that was important. We had an ice box, and the iceman came by with ice in the summer, twice a week. A whole lump of ice. He just walked in your house or put it in your ice box and left.
Even if you weren't home, still?
Oh, sure. We never locked the door. You knew everybody anyway. And if somebody was stealing your chickens, they could find him immediately. Daddy told they did a lot of bootlegging in our part of the world. You think it's Kentucky, but it wasn't altogether. Daddy said at the school I went to, you could, if you knew where they were, you could stand on the steps of the schoolhouse and count about 27 stills out there. They could get more money out of that than raising the corn to sell it and selling it as corn. Um,
So tell me, how did you go from being or how did you meet your husband? Who did you marry and why did you pick him? Tell me the story.
my husband, Ron Richardson, was a local boy. I went off to college after high school. He's um, he was the son of a local minister, very nice young man, but I never went to school with him, so I didn't meet him that way. He went away to another town to a bigger high school we went to the same high school, but never at the same time. And then he was in the class of 1945, and that was the class that young men got their draft notices along with their high school diplomas. And one of the things they did at that time was to avoid getting in the army and having to serve on land was to go to someplace in the Christmas vacation of senior year and enlist in the Navy, which they did. And then the Navy had you report to them immediately after graduation. So he'd been gone all those years, and I never really knew him then. Our parents were friends, but we didn't know each other. There was just enough time and a distance where we were at the same times, which is probably just as well. Anyway, he came home when I was a senior in high school and immediately became my boyfriend. And a year or so later, we got married, which wasn't unusual in 1948 or 47. I graduated from Gallatin High School in 1947. Next year, I went to Central Methodist College at Fayette, Missouri. It's now Central Methodist University, but it wasn't then. And,
So what was it like back then, being married and being a young girl?
At that age, I don't know. It's been so long. We were married 72 years altogether. Um, our son was born 12 years later, so I had a lot of time to work and fool around. And
so what did you do? What were some of the jobs you had before you had your child? Tell me that.
My first and only child. um, well, I had a couple of years of college, which was not unusual at that time. It was felt to be nice, but not obligatory. Girls getting 4-year degrees. There just wasn't much market for it. You were supposed to stay home, have the obligatory 2.6 children, and raise them. What I did, a lot of things, I realized that a nice liberal arts college, even if it was a couple of years, wasn't any qualification for any kind of job I could get, being a young girl and married. So I went to a couple of years to secretarial school. We were living in Kansas City at the time. And I was secretary to a bank president. And I worked at Cargill Incorporated, the grain company, down on the Board of Trade, which is fun. I was deputy to the county clerk in Daviess County, Missouri. And the courthouse gang, we were all like a bunch of nice ants. They were fun.
And tell me more about working in the courthouse. In the courthouse, you did what?
The county clerk actually was the clerk of the county court, the judges that did the roads and bridges and paid the county funds and everything. She was a lady that had been county clerk for ages and kind of an old politician. She was quite a politician. She was a very nice woman. She hired me. My dad was a good Democrat. He'd run for office, not successfully, I might add. And I think my credentials were good. Anyway, it was kind of fun. In Missouri at the time, the county clerk was the ex officio registrar of births and everything, so we had the files on that. I was in that courthouse several years ago, and the file's still in the same place in the vault. They haven't moved it. I It was really kind of boring, except on court days, but we took tax roll, paid taxes. We did. I'm trying to remember. It's been many years ago.
Well, let me ask you this: how did you go from being working in the courthouse to ending up in Little Rock? Tell me that story.
Well, it's been a long time. In the first place, my husband got incorporated into Kansas City Life Insurance Company's corporate training program for agency management. Kansas City Life was a very reputable life insurance company at the time. In fact, it was the highest priced stock on the stock market in those years, and I'm speaking mid-50s. And he felt very fortunate. His father had been an insurance man and an evangelistic preacher, but that's a whole other story. But Ron, my husband, it was quite a step up, and of course we got to move into Kansas City, and out of a 1,800 population town, even if it does have an interesting history, and it was fun, and we were young, and it was great. I think I'm losing my thread of thought.
So, what was Kansas City like when you got there? You said your husband gets a big job, so you're moving from the country to town. Tell me what about that transition?
Well, we had a nice little apartment. After all, we were a fairly young, childless couple. And, corporate wives weren't supposed to work, but what was I supposed to do? So I looked around for a part-time job, and I started to work for a local psychiatrist. Very interesting. One of the nicest people I've ever known. He was Freudian. He taught at the University of Kansas Medical School over across the river. He was head of the psychiatric department at Menorah Hospital, and he saw patients about 3 days a week. A psychiatrist does not need a nurse, he needs a secretary. And that's what it was. But I've decided I wanted to not be a psychiatrist secretary anymore. Went to work in the local bank, which was up the street. And that was interesting too, in the sense that there was no branch banking in Missouri at that time. Every bank was a separate entity with its own officers and everything. Again, I was secretary to the president and opened all new accounts. I've never been a bank teller. I've made loans, but I've never been a teller. And it was kind of fun. It was right up the street. You saw everybody you knew. Our little Brooks, we lived in South Kansas City. We bought our first house and lived in South Kansas City in the old plaza area. Brookside was a local shopping center that was very charming, about 63rd and Warnell Road. So it was neat. Kansas City at that time was a town that had a nightlife. You couldn't get a bad meal there. And we had an awfully good time. It was fun.
So, why did you end up leaving?
Some corporate changes took place in Kansas City Life, and he got a better offer at Union Life in Little Rock. We moved there. And that was in 1972. Our only child, Ronnie, was born at St. Luke's Hospital in Kansas City, December 17th, 1960. So by then we had an 11-year-old boy.
So what was it like for him coming from?
It wasn't a bad thing. He wasn't in high school yet. He was young enough to make. There were a lot of kids in our neighborhood at that time. I didn't like our house, but there wasn't a great deal to buy at that point. It was like now, there hadn't been a lot of building going on. We lived out in West Little Rock, and it was just beginning to start to build up at that point. I'm talking about 1972.
So
And
tell me about Little Rock in 1972. What was it
well,
like?
there were only two restaurants you could go to that you could get a drink. Uh, Steak and Ale and the Leather Bottle. You say you were going out to dinner. Well, which one this time? It really got to be funny.
What was the difference between living in Kansas City and living in Little Rock? You said you had moved, so kind of tell me what was the difference.
Just the size and the amount of activity. And there was a great deal of difference between living in Kansas City and Little Rock. Kansas City is a much larger, more cosmopolitan place. And I met other people at that time who also came from Kansas City. And we found it pretty backward, to be truthful. As I said earlier, there were two restaurants where, were normal for Kansas City people, Leather Bottle and Steak and Ale. And you sort of divided yourself between those, and that was it. I know there were other things, but we were strangers. We didn't know about Tijuana, and we didn't belong to the country clubs as a rule. We were too new and not that affluent. And yes, there was a lot of difference. It was a culture shock, to be honest. Little Rock was very parochial.
So what did you like about Little Rock? Some of the things you liked were what?
Well, I really liked the kind of small town atmosphere it had. But again, I like to get to Kansas City to shop. Um, it wasn't unpleasant. The schools were nice. And I was in Kansas City working in a bank at the time of the Central High crisis. We had children that were that lost year that were coming to Kansas City to stay with relatives to go to high school. I met them often. They were coming in the bank to talk to us, and all kind of things. We were a suburban bank, and we got a lot of people that were moving in for that reason.
So what was Little? How did you find Little Rock? Tell me more about it. Who were some of the people you met and some of the things you did when you moved there?
Well, I'm trying to think. I wasn't working at that point. I had a 12-year-old, and who hasn't changed much.
Well, tell me about your son. Who was he and what was he like?
uh, would be truthful, and I've been asked this question several times. Very inquiring, very into everything, very busy. Only word I can really use to describe is driven. When he gets his idea of something to do, he does it until he gets tired of it. And that's liable to be several years. I think not long after that was when he got into RC modeling and built flightless airplanes. We stepped over them.
So when did he start doing it and what would he do?
Build. Mm-hmm. He'd fly them. And of course, it's a lot of. He played the trumpet, so he wanted to be first chair. He didn't get to be, so he could play in the trumpet. But I mean, as far as the flightless airplanes, he was building gliders, and they were like 6 feet wide, and you had to go out with him to places where there were good thermal winds so he could fly them and radio control them. And then they get lost, and we had to go find them. He played in the band. He was in Parkview High School soon. And he grew up.
Any other stories you can think of to tell me about him?
Oh, I don't know whether I could tell him in public or not.
Well,
He,
what about his hair? Did that ever become an issue with his dad? Tell me about that
oh, I
story.
forgot about that. I think something. Ron was. This was really the long hair era, and he wanted to have it when he was before we came to Little Rock, but I wasn't letting him grow out because I told him he wouldn't keep it clean, and he wouldn't have at that age. Well, you can grow it out if you keep it clean. And all, if I thought he wasn't, I'd just sniff the air delicately and he'd immediately go wash it. His father hated it so bad that after he grew up and left home, he found and destroyed every photograph of him with that long hair. He finally got it off in college. He didn't have it by the time he got out of Hendrix. It was my hairdresser who cut his hair said, "We finally did it." He said, "I don't think he's going to die because he lost all that." He looked much better, much.
Well, talk about Ron and his family and his granddaughter.
Ron, oh,
Roland, or my friend Ron.
our son, and he's called Ronnie because his father is Ron. Their legal name, each one of them, is Rollin, Rollin. And son married a girl from Stuttgart after college. They were both, I think, 25. Her name was Lisa Hudgens. And about 7 years later, they had a little girl. And her name is Sarah, and she's our only grandchild. She graduated recently from the University of Alabama and then from Alabama Law School. And she's now an attorney at a firm in Gainesville, Georgia, specializing in family law. And last year, about soon be a year, we have a new little granddaughter, my great-granddaughter, named Charlotte. Charlie for short. And I'm not sure she's not already walking. Haven't heard yet, but it could have happened yesterday. And of course, we think she's adorable. Whether she is or not, we don't know. We think so, and that's all that counts.
If she was going to watch this video in the future someday and listen to you, what advice would you tell her, or maybe others in your family, that you would give them?
Take advantage of the opportunities that come your way. They may never come by again. Don't put off things. Don't put off opportunities of things you really want to do.
Give an example if you can think of one.
Well, the other thing I was going to add to that is if you're imagining enough to visualize it, you can have it, but you may have to wait a long time.
What are some things maybe that you've watched Ronnie do that would give you examples of good advice for people, or maybe things that he's done that you think he's done well?
Well, I don't know exactly what you mean by that. He's always been a pretty good driver, and I may not have heard you correctly.
Oh, you were giving examples, and I just wondered if you had any examples of things he's done, maybe you think that are good advice people could learn.
Well, he's taken a lot of art courses in college just because he wanted to do it. You know, he said he'd probably never have another opportunity. And I think he derived a great deal of satisfaction from it, a great deal of, well, patience and handiness, good qualities, relaxation. He likes to do pottery.
So, are you maybe saying it's important to do things for fun?
It is important, I think. You live a very arid existence if you don't and can't. Or can't find time and will to make some time for yourself. You really must.
Um, what about you talked earlier about growing up and living during the Depression and how that can shape people and how hard it was? What are some lessons maybe that you
Lessons.
learned from the Depression you could share with people?
Uh, well, I'll quote a saying my father always said that the good times don't last forever, but the bad times don't either. Things do change. You just have to hold on and wait. And he was right, of course. He was right about a good many things. One of the things that I used to think when I was small, we had a uh, encyclopedia in our classroom in the country school when I was little, a very good illustrated one. And I used to read it and look at the pictures of the Holy Land and of the jewel house in London where the crown jewels are and wonder if I'd ever get to see them. Well, as life worked out, I had to wait till I was over 50, but I've been in that jewel house 4 times. I mean, I wanted to see them. I don't know that I wanted to see them that often, but and I've been to the Holy Land 3.
Well, talk about how you started a career that ended up giving you a tremendous amount of travel. Can you tell me that story?
Sure.
Start at the beginning.
Well, it was probably about January of 1977. Son was 16 and driving. I didn't have to be his chauffeur and social secretary any longer. And I was really approaching age 50 and knowing if I was going to do anything with the rest of my life. You know, when you have an only child and they grow up and leave home, there you are. But I had a friend who was a former stewardess for American Airlines and worked in our local sales office. And she was explaining to me, and I really didn't know what retail travel agents did. I mean, we'd had traveled considerably, but it was all in the U.S. and usually by automobile, and people just simply didn't really know too much about what they did, unless you really were wealthy and traveled a great deal, and then that wasn't anybody we knew very well. And she explained it and said, well, you really need to do that. And this was just when people were really starting to go places by airplane. I'm talking late 70s, but it wasn't one of those everybody flies and there's no other way to get there. That came later. Oh, you just love it. You get to do all these things. And contrary to popular belief, the what we call familiarization tours, fam trips, are not free. I'm going to clear that up at once. And they're put on by the airlines and by the hotels and tour companies to enable agents where at that time 70% of the business that came to them came via us. So it was well to cultivate us. And we needed to see it. The saying was you couldn't sell it if you hadn't seen it. I thought, oh boy, that's for me. But there was no school for it. There were, but there wasn't one in Little Rock at that time. So I had to find somebody that would hire me and let me learn on the job. That took a while, but I managed. The rules were at that time that you could not actually travel as an agent. That is, the airline discounts and all the things that came to you because you did. And of course, you don't get that immediately either anyway. You get it when you have a proven sales record. They don't want you going to Africa on their nickel when you're not going to sell anybody on Africa. But anyway, I did, and it was a long, hard year. I worked at below standard rate just to get there in and learn. Back then, this was before all agents were automated. Airlines didn't really operate too much on computers. And I'm talking in 77 to 1980 was when everything was starting to get automated. So we all had to learn it and know and learn all the airport codes and everything else. And back then, we had what we call live tickets. You had ticket stock, and you wrote them by hand. I found an agency that would hire me, and they did, and I managed to stay out of trouble. And then I got hired over on this side by the oldest agency in Little Rock, Kruger Travel. Miss Florence Kruger started her agency when she was the only one in Little Rock. I think Byron House is the only other one, and he was originally a railroad agent. But she was in her 80s at that time, so.
So what was it like for you being in business, finally having this new career, and what did you do and what did you like about it?
Well, of course, in the first place, is Miss Kruger was fond of saying you're never bored, which is perfectly true, you're not. And you meet everybody. And if you like solving puzzles, a lot of that is like that. Can you find a flight at a price they want to pay or can pay? Do you find one the time they want to go? Can you find them a seat on it? Do you know much about cruise ships? Do you know how to tell them what to wear and what the weather will more likely be? I've had people ask me what you wear to dinner on a cruise ship. Well, how would I know if I hadn't been on one? And how they vary and which one you might like or not like. Of course, you do all that, and it only comes with time. I spent 30 years doing it.
You talked about your fam trips.
Uh-huh.
Tell me some of the places you went and some of the memories you have. I know there's a lot, but give me some of the few we've talked about. Can you think of?
Usually when you first start out, they don't let you go anywhere until at least 6 months or a year. And that's good because you need to have something to. I mean, what good is it if you don't know how to do it, what the office work you're supposed to be doing? The first time, I think most of the first time you go anywhere as an agent back then was Mexico. Because it's close, because we get a lot of tourism there. And I don't know that we do these days. I haven't worked in a long time. The ones I thought were great was the first time I went was South America. And Braniff was still flying at that time. Braniff got the South American routes away from Pan Am because Harry Truman knew Tom Braniff. Well, it was a little interesting sidelight, but that was something we kind of knew. They kind of started around Kansas City, and Mr. Truman spent a long lifetime after he was president living in Independence. But I digress. That trip, we went first to Buenos Aires, then to Iguazu Falls. We crossed the Prado River on a boat and cleared customs into Brazil in what looked like an old gas station. And then we went to Asunción, Paraguay. Paraguay is visited by about 200 Americans a year, and I can certainly see why. It's an inland city. It's very, very flat. And I think were a dictatorship at the time. They were having an election, and there was one candidate. His name was Stroessner, German expatriate. And on to Lima and Guayaquil, and well, where else? Anyway, we were a lot of different places. We ended up in Panama City, Panama, and back in Miami. I think we covered 6 cities in one day. We looked at hotels. We looked at the local. We ate the food. We went to the museums. Well, and it was great, but I've never been tireder in my life when I got home. And I learned to make omelets. We were in first class on Braniff, and at that time the cabin steward served fresh omelets to first class for breakfast on long flights. That kid was good. He really knew how to make an omelet. Well, you learn interesting things that way.
Um, Tell me more about other trips you take. Did you take some, other parts of the world maybe that were?
Oh, I took a group out of Stuttgart to Cologne, Germany for a week one time. 57 people. And it was cold because they wouldn't go except after deer season. They were visiting Hochner Humboldt Deutsch Company, which manufactured irrigation equipment out of Stuttgart. We had a nice group. We did the best food in Germany is the executive dining room of KHD. It was wonderful. We took our group up the Rhine and saw castles and all kind of things.
What about the things like the pyramid, the Forbidden City, some of the elephants? Tell me about some of
Oh,
those trips.
well, I was thinking about Cologne and it was great. And then we went, oh, I've been on about 6 Mediterranean cruises. And now that is my favorite. Usually they're about 12 days and they normally, let's see, we've sailed out of Lisbon, I've sailed out of Barcelona, I've sailed out of Athens several times and that is, well, I was going to tell you about the first time we went to Israel.
Yeah.
And I think it's the last time Israel's had a period of relative peace. It was early 80s, and we were guests of the Israeli Tourist Commission. And has anybody ever flown El Al? I flew her out of New York. Check-in time and connection time for El Al at that time, and I don't think anything's changed, is 3 hours. Anybody boarding El Al has to be taken privately into a room with an El Al employee, a very matronly lady and a very tough lady, who questions you for hours about your luggage, what you're doing there. You cannot believe the sternness of them. And they still have that. El Al does not come, well, they didn't then. They come into Chicago and they come into Atlanta, I think, now. But anyway, that's what I did, and that's interesting in itself. They have a special section on board the flight I was on for Hasidic Jews. They will not sit by a woman. And anyway, we toured all of Israel. We went as far south as Masada. We went as far north as Beirut. And we saw the Israeli Navy. It was 2 gunboats on the Dead Sea.
Where's this from?
That's from Egypt, I think. Yeah, it is.
So if I showed you some of these photos, tell me about what they're. This is okay. So just go through what are these?
This was in Egypt, and I went there on a cruise, and our stop was in Cairo, and we overnighted there. And I think we were out at the pyramids, but I don't see them in the background. Oh, that's in Upper Thailand in Chiang Mai at an elephant camp. And that's Louise Bone from Fayetteville on the elephant with me. The Mahout got off to take her picture. Oh, that one is in the inside of the Forbidden City in Beijing. Not the outside that you see, which is Tiananmen Square, but the inside after you're just in. The entrance is behind me. And that's the Great Wall. The first time I went to China, I didn't get on the Great Wall. It was sleety and cold, and the tramway wasn't working. So that's on a river in Upper Alaska, and I can't think of the name of it. I think it's the Yukon River. We'd been to Dawson, and we're doing touring around. And that's the same trip as the one before, except this time the pyramid and the Sphinx got in it. That's the Great Pyramid behind the Sphinx. The guy on the wall is a travel writer that was on the same ship I was on. It was Stella Solaris, and it was 87. Well, that's my son, and we're probably out of Mobile.
Any more pictures maybe that we don't have, or any more trips that you want to talk about before we move on to other topics?
Um, I think my favorite was the time we went to Africa on safari. We went to Kenya. It was probably about 92. I'm trying to think. And we flew to New York and boarded Air Italia, Alitalia, the Italian airline, which was great, and connected in Rome and then landed in Nairobi a day later.
You had talked earlier about, the importance of following things that we're passionate about or things that were fun, like Ron's art and things. You seem to have a lot of passion with your connection to the DAR. So, what is the DAR and how did you get involved with it? Tell us, like, if someone knew nothing about it, what would you tell them?
DAR it's well known, mostly over Marian Anderson and not singing. Its headquarters, it's officially National Society Daughters of the American Revolution. It was founded in 1895 and it has no connection with SAR, which is Sons of the American Revolution. The requirement for membership is direct proven descent from a soldier of the Revolution or one who materially aided the revolutionary cause. I've been a member myself since 1953. My grandmother was a DAR. All of my aunts were on my father's side.
So, what would you do if you had to explain to your family what you did? What did you do?
In DAR?
Yeah.
Oh, I've held a number of state chairmanships. I've been regent of my chapter, done whatever committee requirements they needed me to.
Oh, okay.
We're very active in reserving historical monuments, making them. We have schools to aid in American Indians and mountain children. There's a mountain school in Alabama, Crossnor, in northern Alabama. Son Ron worked with a guy who went to school there. He loves the daughters. We provide scholarships, we do patriotic work, and we also work with veterans. That's one of our major things. We're not political. We try to stay clear of that, and we need to. Our national headquarters are in Washington, D.C., called Memorial Continental Hall and Constitution Hall. The largest thing people remember that is not to the daughter's credit is in the early 40s or late 39. I don't remember. I wasn't a daughter at the time. I wasn't old enough. Marian Anderson was supposed to sing in Continental Hall. It was at the time it was the only big auditorium in Washington. Was the reason, and the daughters simply didn't allow black artists to perform there. And then there was, and Eleanor Roosevelt gave up her membership because of, well, for political reasons probably. She was a DAR, belonged to DAR. Eleanor Roosevelt at the time, she was First Lady, and Bess Truman was a DAR, Independence Pioneers chapter. But I've been a member of a Little Rock Gilbert Marshall chapter since 1973. But I was a DAR long before that. I never served in a really large capacity because I've been doing all these other things, and it can be very time consuming. I've been a page at Continental Congress, which is our national convention, 50 years ago.
If someone came to you and said, "What are some of the most interesting stories in your long life?" and you could just pick a few of the best stories, maybe stuff we hadn't talked about already. What would be some of the things that you remember over the years?
What I remember, and it's really very brief compared to some of the really big things that have happened, was the two ladies that came into my office in Little Rock, sat at my desk, and this has been many years ago, by the way, and said, "We want to go to Hiawatha and we want to stay on Waukegan." Well, I kind of looked at them and I said, "All right." Well, I took it to mean they wanted to stay in Waikiki. And then they said, "And we want to stop in Los Angeles." And I said, "Well, that's nice. And we can do that. And is the flight from Los Angeles to Hawaii nonstop?" And I refrained from saying, "Oh, God, I certainly hope so." But I had a map over my desk, and I said, "Well, there really isn't any place to stop in between, so of course it is." They looked at it. We got them set up, and they loved it and had a good time and came back, and they really liked it. But I really had to stop and think what they meant. um, I was thinking about the time that I had some people on TWA and they got to Johannesburg, South Africa, and lost their tickets. And this is when tickets were a confirmation from the computer. They were handwritten tickets, and each coupon was just the same as money. There was a coupon for every leg of the flight. And they were calling me from Johannesburg, from the TWA office, saying, "What's our ticket number? TW will help us if we can give the ticket number." Well, fortunately, I was standing right by the door where we kept the ticket stubs that had the number on them, so I thought I was going to lose my mind before I found it, but there it was. And they got home safely, and I never did find out how come they lost them, but they did. People are always losing tickets. Wally Hall over the Gazette, we had to really go lecture about throwing unused tickets away. They were the same as money. You remember this sports writer? Well, Wally apparently thought they were no good if he didn't use them. He was a mess.
Tell me more about Wally.
Well, we liked him, but we had to straighten him out every once in a while. I finally got Miss Kruger to go down there and give him a lecture, which she could do. Well, she was about 88 at the time. She sat him down and said, "Now, honey." She did. I don't know who else she straightened out.
What did he do to get in trouble? What did he do to get in trouble?
Through his tickets, if he didn't go on a trip, and sports writers were always doing that. Something would come up and they make a reservation, get a ticket, and then something come up else and they wouldn't go. So they didn't add an unused ticket. Well, to them, they didn't use it, so it didn't have value. But it actually did have value. And they keep throwing them away, and and then the paper would want the money back. If they didn't use it, well, there was some money involved. And they were blithely just getting rid of them. We just wanted him to quit. Give the tickets to somebody reliable and we'll get them back, but don't stop that.
So, any other stories before we get down to our last couple of questions that you can think of? Maybe stuff I didn't ask about?
Well, I'm trying to think. Oh, I'm thinking about the time the people that ticketed us going to Kenya. We went back and connected in Rome, and whoever wrote the tickets forgot about the overnight. We had an overnight flight, so the next flight should have been dated the same day, the next day. Well, those little girls that wrote those tickets didn't do that. So there we were on Alitalia, 6 women, And the manager for Alitalia in the Rome airport was saying, I can't take you girls home with me. My wife wouldn't like it. I've got to find a flight for you to get home on. So they did. They put us on, they advertise a lot now. Polish Air, anyway. Or anyway, they got us on when we were all in first class, so we didn't think it was too horrible. It loses something, but I think I just forgot what airline it was. It was one that you wouldn't normally ever fly.
Well, if 50 years from now when you're gone, what kind of advice could you give somebody that might be helpful for them, that you could tell them? What would you say?
Uh, if you come to an abandoned road, take it. To quote old Yogi Berra. Don't be afraid. Don't back down. Go do things. Opportunities come your way. Learn to recognize them. And don't be scared. Take them. If you live right, you only live once. If you do it right, once is enough. That's my motto. At least I hope it is.
Anything else?
That's about it. Be nice to other people and they'll be nice to you. I've literally never been lost in a foreign country, even though I don't speak any foreign languages. I've been on a train in Germany when I didn't speak a word of German and they didn't speak a word of English. But I happened to get in a compartment with a couple of professors that did speak English. I didn't even have a ticket. I just got on it. And they said, we'll take care of it. The conductor will come. You have money, and I produced money. I said, I don't really know what to pay him. He said, just hold out some money. He'll take what he needs. And he did. I mean, I think I must lead a charmed life because I've never really gotten in any trouble. If I needed help, help appeared. A positive attitude helps a lot too. And if you want to get an upgrade, you ask politely. And don't wear denim. Dress nicely and ask politely.